Chapter 18 Radiocarbon Dating. Radiocarbon dating is frequently invoked as the final authority in discussions surrounding the age of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Once a laboratory range is published, the matter is often treated as settled, and alternative historical models are dismissed as unnecessary, speculative, or unscientific. The presence of numerical ranges, confidence intervals, and institutional credentials creates the impression of objectivity that appears to place the scrolls beyond serious chronological dispute. Yet this confidence is less the result of what carbon dating actually demonstrates than how its conclusions are cul- culturally received. Scientific methods, particularly those associated with physics and chemistry, carry a rhetorical weight that exceeds their explanatory scope. When a technical measurement is translated into historical claim, the distinction between what is measured and what is inferred is often lost. Radiocarbon dating was never designed to date texts, ideas, or acts of composition. It measures the decay of radioactive carbon in organic material that was once part of a living system. When applied to manuscripts, the method does not engage the content of the text, the circumstances of its writing, or the historical processes that shaped its transmission. Instead, it provides a probabilistic estimate for when the raw material parchment, papyrus, or associated organic matter ceased exchanging carbon with the atmosphere. Despite these limitations, C14 results are routinely treated as direct evidence for when the scrolls were written, copied, or deposited. This, slip, this slippage between material dating and textual dating is rarely acknowledged, yet let alone examined. The result is a methodological shortcut. A complex historical problem is reduced to a laboratory output, and uncertainty is exchanged for apparent precision. I argue that carbon dating does not and cannot securely date the Dead Sea Scrolls as texts. At best, it offers a rough chronological bracket for organic substrates whose relationship to the act of writing remains unknown. At worst, it introduces additional layers of uncertainty about material storage, reuse, environmental effects, sample integrity, and interpretive bias, while projecting an aura of scientific finality that the data itself cannot justify. The issue, therefore, is not whether radiocarbon dating is a legitimate scientific technique. It is whether the authority assigned to it in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship is proportionate to what it can actually establish. Before the method can be treated as decisive, its assumptions, limitations, and interpretive boundaries must be confronted rather than assumed. Only then can carbon dating be placed in its proper role, not as a chronological verdict, but as one piece of evidence among many, incapable on its own of resolving a question that spans centuries, cultures, and contested historical reconstructions. Radiocarbon dating operates by measuring the decay of carbon 14, a radioactive isotope absorbed by living organisms during their lifespans. While an organism is alive, its carbon content remains in equilibrium with the atmosphere. Once it dies, carbon 14 begins to decay at a known rate. By measuring the remaining radio of carbon 14 to stable carbon isotopes, laboratories can estimate when the organism ceased living. In the context of the Dead Sea Scrolls, this process applies not to the text itself, but to the organic materials on which the text appears. These materials include animal skins processed into parchment, papyrus fibers derived from harvested plants, and in some cases linen, wrappings, or other organic items associated with the manuscripts. The method, therefore, measures the death of an animal or the harvesting of a plant not the act of writing, copying, editing, or depositing a text. This distinction is fundamental. Carbon dating does not engage with ink, language, scribal practice, or historical circumstance. It cannot detect when a text was composed, when it was copied from an earlier exemplar, or when it entered a particular community's possession. The laboratory results describe the age of a substrate, not the chronological not the chronology of the intellectual activity that later made use of it. The temporal gap between material production and textual inscription is rarely discussed, yet it is both plausible and historically significant. Parchment was a valuable commodity. Animal skins required intensive preparation and were not casually discarded. In manuscript cultures, especially those operating under conditions of scarcity or reverence for written tradition, materials could be stored, reused, trimmed, or repurposed long after their initial preparation. The same applies to papyrus, which could be stockpiled, transported, or reused depending on availability and demand. As a result, the intervals between the death of an animal and the moment its skin was inscribed is not merely uncertain, it is unknowable. This gap could span years, decades, or potentially longer, and carbon dating offers no mechanism for narrowing it. The methods remain silent on when ink first touched the surface, even under ideal laboratory conditions, free from contamination, with precise calibration and well documented samples. Radiocarbon dating can establish only a terminus post mortem, the earliest possible date after which writing could have occurred. It cannot supply a com, com, comps, it cannot supply a composition, a composition. It cannot supply a composition. Yeah, whatever. A date, an exact date. We'll go with that. A copying date or a historically context for the text itself. Any argument that treats carbon 14 results as a direct indicator of when a Dead Sea Scroll was written, therefore, rests on an unspoken assumption that material production and textual composition occurred in close temporal proximity. This assumption may be convenient, but it is not demonstrated by the method, and it cannot be tested by it. Until this limitation is acknowledged, the interpretive use of carbon dating is in manuscript studies remains methodologically overstated. Public presentation of radiocarbon results for the Dead Sea Scrolls tends to foreground the earliest possible ranges. Dates extending into the pre Christian centuries are routinely highlighted, cited, and repeated, often framed as decisive confirmation of a first century BC origin, and concealment in context in contrast, rather, the later ends of the same calibrated ranges, particularly those extending into the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, receive markedly less attention. This asymmetry is not derived. I can't read today. This asymmetry is not driven by the data itself. Many published carbon 14 results of for scrolls materials include probability distributions that extend well beyond the commonly cited terminus. In a number of cases, the calibrated ranges overlap significantly with an early 2nd century AD. These later dates are not rare anomalies appearing in isolated samples, they are a recurring feature of the dataset as a whole. Rather than being treated as evidence requiring explanation, these later ranges are often rhetorically managed. They are described as statistically insignificant tales compress through averaging, or dismiss as methodological noise. In some cases, emphasis is placed on the midpoint of a probability range, while the full span, sometimes covering multiple centuries, is left unexamined. The effect is subtle but cumulative. The public facing narrative conveys chronological precision while the underlying data remains broad and internally tensioned. The problem is not that the early dates exist, it is that the existence of later dates is treated as inconsequential by default. If even a portion of the scroll materials can plausibly date into the 2nd century AD, then the standard model according to which the scrolls are composed, copied, and concealed before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 loses its exclusivity. The historical timeline becomes less settled, not more. Importantly, this tension arises without invoking alternative theories, external assumptions, or speculative reconstructions. It emerges directly from the carbon data itself. The laboratory results do not uniformly converge on a narrow pre Christian window, they permit a wide chronological horizon than is often acknowledged. This does not require that all scrolls be late, nor does it demand a wholesale redating of the corpus. It requires only the recognition that the material evidence, as reported, does not decisively exclude a 2nd century context. When later ranges are consistently present when later ranges are consistently present but systematically de-emphasized, the appearance of certainty is sustained not by the data but by the way it is framed. In this sense, the problem of late dates is not an external challenge imposed on the carbon record, it is an internal feature of it. Properly considered, the radiocarbon evidence does not simply support the official timeline, it quietly strains against it. Radiocarbon dating does not operate in a vacuum. It its results are calibrated against a broader scientific framework that assumes the Earth is billions of years old and that atmospheric concentrations of carbon 14 have behaved in broadly stable and predictable ways over long periods of time. Calibration curves, correction models, and probability ranges are all constructed within this underlying chronology. These assumptions are typically treated as neutral background conditions rather than inactive variables, yet they are foundational. Carbon dating does not simply measure decay, it interprets that decay through models of past atmospheric behavior. If those models are incorrect or even partially distorted, then the resulting dates will be systematically skewed rather than randomly inaccurate. If, however, the Earth is significantly younger, on the order of 6,000 years as suggested by biblical chronology, then the standard calibration framework becomes problematic. In a young Earth model, early atmospheric conditions would differ markedly from those assumed by conventional radiocarbon science. Carbon 14 cons, concentration concentration carbon 14 concentration prediction rates and decay environments in early history could not simply be projected backwards using modern analogs. Research in activities such as the rate radio uh, let's try that again. Research in initiatives such as the rate project, radio that's a what you call it, radioisotopes and the age of the Earth, the rate project, have argued that radiometric decay rates in atmospheric conditions may have been accelerated or altered in the past, particularly during catastrophic periods in history. Noah's flood within. Yeah, let's try that again. Within such a. Where are we? Where are we? Uh, start from here. Fine, we'll start over. Research initiatives such as the RATE project have argued that radiometric decay rates and atmospheric conditions may have been accelerated or altered in the past, particularly during catastrophic periods in history, Noah's flood. Within such a framework, samples from the early centuries AD could appear artificially old when interpreted through standard calibration curves. The disruption would not need to be dramatic to be consequential. Even a shift of several decades materially affects manuscripts' chronologies. This points this point is especially relevant for the Dead Sea Scrolls. The difference between a late 1st century date and an early to mid-century 2nd century date is not trivial. It directly impacts historical reconstructions regarding authorship, community, context, and concealment. If radiocarbon calibration systematically inflates age estimates by even 50 to 100 years under younger Earth conditions, then material commonly assigned to the 1st century could plausibly belong to the 2nd. The purpose of raising this issue is not to demand acceptance of a particular cosmological model. It is to note that radiocarbon dating is not a self contained measurement, but a model dependent interpretation. When that model is assumed rather than examined, its conclusions acquire an authority they have not earned. In, in contested historical contexts, especially those spanning the narrow margins between the 1st and 2nd centuries, such assumptions matter. If the calibration framework itself is open to question, then carbon 14 results cannot be treated as chronologically decisive. At most, they offer approximate material ages conditioned by the very assumptions under review. Beyond theoretical concerns about calibration models, radiocarbon dating is the dating in the Dead Sea Scroll. Blah, 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 blah. Try that again. Beyond theoretical concerns about calibration models, radiocarbon dating in the Dead Sea region presents a more concrete difficulty. The presence of extreme anomalies within the same environmental context as the scrolls themselves. One of the most frequently cited examples is the dating of organic materials, most notably a basket found in the Judean desert, the Maharbat cave south of Qumran. It was assigned radiocarbon age approaching 10,000 years. Under conventional old Earth assumptions, such dates are interpreted as evidence of deep antiquity. Under a young Earth framework, however, they present a different problem entirely. If the Earth itself is not that old, then these results cannot reflect the true age. They instead point to systematic disruption within the dating process. In other words, the issue is not how old the basket is, but why the method produces ages that exceeds possible historical limits. What makes this problem particularly relevant is the geographic proximity to the Dead Sea Scrolls. These anomalous dated materials were not recovered from distant or unrelated environments. They originate from the same broader region, subject to similar atmospheric condition, geographical features, and environmental histories. If carbon dating produces dramatically inflated ages for some organic items in this setting, it becomes methodologically unsound to assume that nearby manuscript materials are immune from comparable disruption. Several mechanisms have been proposed to account for such anomalies, including localized atmospheric variation, reservoir effects, contamination from older carbon sources, or complex depositional processes. The specific cause is less important here than the shared implication. Radiocarbon results in this region may be subject to environmental influences that skew measurements in a consistent direction rather than introducing random noise. The presence of such outliers undermines the assumptions that C14 dating operates with uniform reliability across all contexts. If the method can yield dates that exceed the age of the Earth itself under the chronological framework already outlined, then confidence in its precision for fine-grained distinctions becomes difficult to justify. A tool capable of producing extreme inflation in one set of samples cannot be uncritically trusted to distinguish narrow historical windows in another. For the Dead Sea Scrolls, this matters precisely because the debate does not hinge on millennia, but on decades. The difference between a first century and the second century context is historically decisive, yet radiocarbon dating in this region has demonstrably produced errors several orders of magnitude larger. Against this Against that backdrop, claims of precision appear overstated. The basket problem, therefore, functions as a cautionary signal. It does not, by itself, date the scrolls later. It demonstrates that regional factors can produce results so anomalous that confidence in localized radiocarbon precision must be reevaluated. When a method shows the capacity for dramatic miscalculation in the same environment, its authority over marginal chronological questions cannot remain unquestioned. Another factor rarely addressed in discussion of Dead Sea Scrolls radiocarbon dating is sample provenance. That is, the documented history of how a tested sample moved from excavation context to laboratory analysis. Radiocarbon laboratories do not excavate manuscripts themselves, nor do they interpret independently verify the origin of the materials they receive. They analyze samples supplied by curators, institutions, or designated intermediaries. The laboratory's responsibility is narrowly defined to measure the age of the material presented, not to the authentic the authentic not to authenticity autistic on jeez the laboratory's responsibility is narrowly defined to measure the age of the material presented, not to authenticate it. Yeah, you know what I'm trying to say. Its archaeological source or historical identity. This distinction is critical. A laboratory's result is only as meaningful as the certainty that tested material is generally derived from the object is claimed that. Let's reread that. A laboratory's result is only as meaningful as the certainty that the tested material generally derives from the object it is claimed to represent. Carbon dating can accurately measure the age of organic matter, but it cannot confirm that the matter tested came from the particular scroll, fragment, or manuscript corpus. That determination lies entirely outside the scope of the method, and the rest instead on the institutional trust. This raises the uncomfortable but unavoidable question: how secure is the chain of custody for every Dead Sea Scroll sample that has been carbon dated? In many cases, samples were extracted decades after discovery, following prolonged periods of storage, restoration, trimming, conservation, and restricted scholarly access. Documentation standards varied, records were incomplete, and control over the materials was often concentrated within a small number of institutions operating under intense political and cultural scrutiny. In this context, the possibility of substitution or selective sampling cannot be dismissed as merely hypothetical. In light of the Epstein files, corruption at these institutions is not hard to imagine. The Dead Sea Scrolls were not neutral artifacts. From the moment of their discovery, they become entangled with the modern state of Israel's efforts to establish historical continuity, territorial legitimacy, and cultural primacy. In older dating framework, especially one extending into the pre-Christian centuries, serves powerful national, ideological, and diplomatic purpose. It anchored Jewish presence in the land deep into antiquity and reinforced a narrative of uninterpreted, uninterpreted inheritance. Under such conditions, motive must be acknowledged alongside method. The institutional provision of substituted samples, materials known or believed to be ancient, would offer straightforward means of securing favorable radiocarbon results without requiring falsification at the laboratory level. In such a scenario, the laboratory's findings could be entirely accurate with respect to the material tested, while being wholly irrelevant to the scroll fragment which they assume to represent. Also, this I didn't put this in the book. I figured this out a little bit later after I published. Somebody sent me an article where if you can contaminate a medieval fragment with fossil fuel, and you'll get the same results as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which a test was done to demonstrate that their cleaning methods were really not any good. Where they contaminated they had three samples where they contaminated one with fossil fuel, another one with uh, castor oil, and then they just had a control one where it was more to see how effective the cleaning methods were for these scrolls, and it demonstrated that the cleaning was not that they still got these skewed results, but they got these for the castor oil it was showing to be much younger, and then with the one with the fossil fuel it showed the same Dead Sea Scroll date. And I've been leaning a whole lot more that the whole Dead Sea Scrolls are all just medieval and forgeries. But again, ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to the book here. Under such conditions, motive. No, we read that, didn't we? Oh, maybe we didn't. We'll read it again. Under such conditions, motive must be acknowledged alongside method. The institutional provision and substitute samples materials, known or believed to be ancient, would offer a straightforward means of securing favorable radiocarbon results without requiring falsification at the laboratory level. In such a scenario, the laboratory's findings could be entirely accurate with respect to the materials tested, while being wholly irrelevant to the scroll's fragments they were assumed to represent. This does not require a global conspiracy or universal complicity. It requires only localized control over sampling, restricted access to materials, and the the expectation that results aligning with an established narrative would be rigorously challenged. Radiocarbon laboratories operating in good faith would have no mechanism for detecting such substitution. The method contains no internal safeguard against provenance fraud. The integrity of radiocarbon dating, therefore, depends not only on calibration curves, contamination controls, or statistical modeling, but on the transparency and reliability of the entire chain of custody, from excavation and storage to sampling and submission. Where that chain is opaque, uh, politically sensitive, or institutionally insulated from external review, confidence in the resulting dates must be correspondingly limited. In the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where radiocarbon conclusions have been used to stabilize historical narratives with profound cultural and political consequences, this vulnerability cannot be treated as peripheral. It directly affects how much authority such dates can responsibly claim, and whether they function as evidence or as instruments of narrative reinforcement. An even more troubling possibility must be acknowledged: institutional falsification, whether through data handling, interpretive framing, or strategic use of samples whose outcomes are already anticipated. Radiocarbon laboratories are not abstract mechanisms. They are institutions staffed by humans, operating with academic, political, financial and cultural pressures. As such, they are not immune to exper- expectation bias, institutional inertia, or the desire to produce results that align with dominant narratives. This concern is not hypothetical. A revealing parallel is provided by the Dead Sea Scrolls like fragments acquired by the Museum of the Bible. These fragments were initially authenticated. That word, man. These these fragments were initially authenticated, you get what I'm saying, using a range of scientific tests, including radiocarbon dating, and were reported to fall within the pre Christian time frame. On that basis, they were widely presented as genuine ancient manuscripts. Subsequent forensic analysis, however, including ink composition, writing sequence, and microscopic examination, demonstrated conclusively that the fragments were modern forgeries written on ancient material. This case presents a stark dilemma that cannot be easily dismissed. Either the forgers obtained genuinely ancient parchment material dating to the BC period and inscribed it with modern ink, or radiocarbon testing produced results that were interpreted, emphasized, or reported in a way that reinforced an expected antiquity despite contradictory indicators. In either scenario, the episode exposes a fundamental weakness in how radiocarbon results function within manuscript authentication. Jeez. If the parchment was genuinely ancient, then carbon dating proves only what it can ever prove: the age of the material, not the authenticity or antiquity of the text written upon it. A modern forger can pass radiocarbon testing so long as it is executed on old organic material. In this case, a BC date did not protect against deception, it facilitated it. If, on the other hand, the material itself was not ancient to the degree reported, then the implications are more severe. It would suggest that laboratories or associated interpretive authorities either defaulted to BC ranges, selected favorable calibrations, or framed ambiguous results in ways that align with expectation. The public narrative emphasized antiquity, while the possibility of a later or conflicting outcomes was not foregrounded. This does not require global conspiracy or coordinated deception. It requires only localized compliance, selective reporting, or the uncritical acceptance of expected chronological ranges, especially when those ranges reinforce established narratives, serves ideological or national interests, or protects reputation, funding, or let's reread this. It requires only localized compliance, selective reporting, or the uncritical acceptance of expected chronological ranges, especially when those ranges reinforce established narratives, serves ideological or national interests, or protects reputations, funding streams, and institutional authority. In the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the incentives are far stronger. An early dating framework anchors cultural continuity, legitimizes territorial claims, and stabilizes decades of scholarship. Within such an environment, results that conform to expectations are more likely to be accepted without resistance, while anomalous or destabilizing data are more likely to be reframed, minimalized, or excluded from emphasis. The lesson of the Museum of the Bible fragments is not that radiocarbon dating is fraudulent, but is fraudulent by bleh. Let's try this again. The lessons of the Museum of the Bible fragments is not that radiocarbon dating is fraudulent by nature. It is that radiocarbon dating, when detached from rigorous provenance control and treated as decisive rather than conditional, is vulnerable to misuse. A BC date can be produced for an object that is not ancient as a text, Once that is acknowledged, the authority of carbon dating as a generator of authenticity collapses. If modern forgeries can carry ancient radiocarbon signatures and be publicly affirmed on that basis, then press the mere presence of BC dates in the Dead Sea Scroll corpus cannot be treated as decisive proof of antiquity. At minimum, it demands the possibility that some results reflect expectational selection or narrative reinforcement rather than independent chronological discovery. In practice, radiocarbon dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls has functioned less as an independent chronological test and more as a confirmatory device. Rather than serving as a national tool capable of challenging prevailing assumptions, carbon 14 results have largely been interpreted through the lens of an already established historical narrative. The dates that align with the traditional account, pre-Christian composition, 1st century BC transmission, and pre-AD 70 concealment are emphasized and repeated. Dates that strain or complicate that account are reframed, de-emphasized, or quietly absorbed without consequence. This pattern is visible not in overt manipulation but in interpretive practice. When a radiocarbon range overlaps with the expected time frame, it is described as consistent or conflammatory, even when the same range extends well beyond that window. Once such a label is applied, further discussion effectively ends. The breadth of the range, sometimes spanning multiple centuries, is treated as irrelevant so long as part of it intersects with the preferred chronology. Scientific language plays a decisive role in this process. Terms such as confidence interval, calibrated range, and statistical consistency, yeah, consistency, I can't read, conveys precision and finality to non-specific, conveys precision and finality to non-specialists, even when the underlying data is probabilistic and indeterminate. The appearance of rigor substitutes for resolutions. Man, I should have reread this whole thing. I'm not going to. A result need not be narrow or decisive to function rhetorically. It need only avoid overt contradiction. This interpretive asymmetry reveals how carbon dating operates within the broader Dead Sea Scroll discourse. It does not function as a falsification mechanism capable of overturning assumptions, but as a stabilizing one. Results that support the narrative are foregrounded as evidence. Results that introduce tension are absorbed as noise. In neither case does the method independently determine the historical conclusion. The effect is cumulative. Over time, carbon dating comes to be cited not as one line of evidence among many, but as the evidentiary foundation itself. The historical model is said to be scientifically established, and dissenting interpretations are dismissed as ignoring the data, when in fact they often engage the same data but draw different conclusions from it in full range. This is not how a genuinely independent test behaves. An independent test has the capacity to surprise, disrupt, or overturn expectations. Radiocarbon dating, as applied to the Dead Sea Scrolls, rarely does so, but not because the data is unformally clear, but because interpretive boundaries are already in place. When scientific methods are used primarily to reinforce what is already believed, they cease to function as instruments of inquiry and become instruments of narrative maintenance. Carbon dating in this context does not resolve uncertainty, it manages it. It provides the appearance of closure while leaving foundational questions untouched. The result is a stable story supported by scientific language rather than a scientific process open to destabilizing outcomes. Once carbon dating is understood in this way, its authority must be recalibrated. It cannot serve as the final word on Dead Sea Scroll chronology. It, it has never been permitted to function as an independent voice. When stripped of interpretive overreach, radiocarbon dating retains a legitimate, though limited, role in manuscript studies. Properly understood, it can contribute useful information, but only within clearly defined boundaries. Carbon dating can indicate the proximity age of organic material. It can establish whether parchment or papyrus plausibly originates in antiquity rather than medieval or modern period. It can also provide broad chronological brackets that help execute extreme anachronisms. In this sense, carbon radiocarbon testing can rule out very late origins and function as a coarse filter against obvious forgeries executed on modern materials, assuming the labs are faithfully giving truthful data. What it cannot do is mere significant. Carbon dating cannot date the composition of a text, the moment of inscription, or the historical circumstances under which a manuscript was written. It cannot distinguish between material that was used immediately and material that was stored for decades or reused at a later time. It cannot determine whether a text reflects first century, second century, or later theological or historical context, and it cannot override converging evidence drawn from textual criticism, historical analysis, linguistic development, or internal literary features. Most importantly, radiocarbon dating cannot resolve disputes that hinge on narrow chronological margins. When competing models differ by decades rather than millennia, the probabilistic ranges produced by carbon dating lacks the resolution necessary to adjudicate between them. A method that produces multi-century ranges cannot function as a decisive arbiter in debate spanning the late first and early second centuries. Used correctly, carbon 14 dating is supplementary rather than determinative. It can constrain possibilities, but it cannot detect conclusions. But it cannot dictate conclusions. When it is treated as decisive, it ceases to function as evidence and becomes instead rhetorical endpoint, an appeal to scientific authority rather than contribution to historical reasoning. Recognizing these limits does not weaken scholarship, it restores methodological honesty. The carbon dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls is frequently treated as a scientific anchor, an objective foundation capable of settling chronological questions once and for all. In reality, it is better understood as a fragile scaffold dependent on a series of assumptions that are rarely examined in aggregate. These include assumptions about the timing of material use, the stability of atmospheric conditions, the reliability of calibration models, the integrity of sample provenance, and the neutrality of institutional interpretation. When these assumptions are made explicit, the authority commonly attributed to carbon dating begins to erode. The method does not collapse, but its scopes contrast. What remains is a tool capable of offering general constraints, not precise answers. If the Dead Sea Scrolls belong closer to the 2nd century AD, radiocarbon dating does not disprove the conclusions. Properly understood, it allows for it, and in several instances, it quietly accommodates it. The tension between the data and the traditional timeline is not imposed from from outside, it emerges from within the method itself once its ranges are taken seriously rather than selectively. What ultimately fails is not the scrolls nor the scientific technique used to analyze them. What fails is the expectation that a single laboratory method can resolve historical questions it was never designed to answer. Precision has been projected where only probability exists. Finality has been claimed where uncertainty remains. When carbon dating is returned to its proper place, one line of evidence among many, the illusion dissolves. What replaces it is not chaos but clarity, a recognition that the chronology of the Dead Sea Scrolls remains a historical question, not a settled scientific fact.